So if you unmute your microphone and want to say something, just know that you'll get picked up by the video. I'm going to turn off my camera in the hopes that that'll make things a little smoother for us here. So you might recognize the quadratic formula, but I'd be interested to know where you're at with it just right now before we talk about it at all. Again, a 0 is I've never heard of this before, and that's fine if that's the case. A 5 would mean I'm the master of the quadratic formula. Where would you say you are in there? A 3 means like, I'm okay, pretty familiar, but I'm a bit rusty. 2 would mean like, yeah, I remember some of it, but I'm pretty shaky. Where would you say you are on that? Anything from a 0 to 5 is great. Okay, thanks for those responses, everybody. We've got a few 5s and then some like 1s and 2s and some 3s as well. So we're kind of all over the map, which is normal, right? That's kind of expected considering school last year was a bit weird. If you had your grade 10 math first semester last year, you're probably feeling much stronger in this. If you had your grade 10 math second semester, you might be a bit more shaky in this. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because some of you feel like you're very strong in it and it's not honestly that complicated. It looks complicated, but it's not as bad as it looks. So the quadratic formula is just an equation that's going to help us find solutions to quadratic equations. So if I've got an equation like this form below, something x squared plus something x plus something equals 0, and as long as I've got it set up in that form, I can use this quadratic equation to help me solve for what the two, well, it could be no solutions, one solution, or two solutions. We're used to having two solutions, and most of the time that's what we'll get, is two solutions when we're using the quadratic formula. So let's jump in and just try this thing out. First of all, in order to use it, we have to be able to identify what our A's, B's, and C's are. Our A is what's the coefficient of our x squared term, B is a coefficient of our x term, and C is a coefficient, is just our constant number at the end. These could be 0, and if they're 0, they won't appear when we write the thing. So let's try a few of these out. Here's our first one, f of x equals 3x squared minus 4x minus 12. I want to write my A, my B, and my C. Well, my A is right here. It's going to be 3. It's the coefficient of x squared. My B is right here. I got to make sure I don't miss the negative on there. And my C is right here, negative 12. For my next one, you'll notice this is written not in standard form because the x squared term is not first. But that doesn't mean there's any difference. This is still my A value, even though it's just put in a different order. My B value is what's in the coefficient in front of my x, and my C value is just the constant number at the end. So don't be fooled if the function is in a different order than it normally would be. Don't be fooled. A is still the one that's attached to that x squared term. Okay, let's try a couple of other ones down here. What about these guys? Okay. For this one, my A term is easy. It's right there. It's 5. But what about, I've only got 2 terms. Well, this plus 7, that's my C term. My B term is going to be 0. So there's no x term because the coefficient in front of it is 0. So we just don't write it. So my coefficient there is 0 for B. For this next one, okay, I find the x squared term, so my A value is negative 0.5. My B value, coefficient on the x, is negative 8. And my C value is a big 0. And that's okay too. Okay, so now let's actually use the quadratic formula. We're going to jump to the next page and we're going to try them out. We're going to do, I think we'll do 2 of these. So we've got an equation, a quadratic equation, 2x squared plus 5x minus 7 equals 0. We've got that lovely quadratic formula sitting right next to it. The first thing we want to do to make our life nice and easy is we want to identify our A, our B, and our C, just like we did on the previous page. Our A is 2, our B is 5, and our C is -7. Now we're actually going to sub those values into our quadratic equation. Quadratic equation, you notice, has a plus and minus in it. And what the plus and minus does is that means we have one answer when it's plus and a different answer when it's minus. That's how we can end up with two different solutions. Okay, here we go. So we'll say x is equal to, now let's sub in, negative b. So b is 5, so I'm going to put -5. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's 5 squared, minus 4 times a times c. A is 2, c is -7. All of that divided by 2 times a, and a is 2. So the first thing we want to make sure we do is we just can sub everything in properly. It's easy to do if you go slow and are careful. Okay, let's simplify a little bit. Let's take care of some of this stuff in here. 5 squared is 25. And 4 times 2 times -7, that's -56. So I'm subtracting a negative number. That's going to be the same as adding. So I want to make sure I notice that. Subtracting a negative number, that's the same as adding. So I've got my -5 plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 56, that's going to be 81. Oh, that's a nice square rootable number. How convenient. Let's move up over here. So we're going to have x equals -5 plus or minus, the square root of 81 is 9. And now we're going to try and split off into two different solutions. We're going to do one with our plus and one with our minus. So x equals -5 plus 9 over 4. And we're also going to do x equals -5 minus 9 over 4. And we'll solve both of those. And if we get two answers, then that means we've got two different solutions to our quadratic function, which we'll often have. So -5 plus 9 is 4, so that's going to be 4 over 4, so that's going to be 1. And -5 minus another 9, that's -14 over 4. We could simplify that to be 7 over 2. 7/2. Okay, so those are our two solutions to our equation. So we'll say x is 1 or -7/2. All right, let's do one more just to firm up our understanding. And I want to mention that, like, you would use this. This works anytime. So the quadratic function works anytime. The quadratic equation. But usually it's easier to just factor. This is really useful when something's not factorable. So basically when you would end up with like a weird decimal number. So if something's not factorable, this is the way to go, because it'll always get you to the right answer, even if it's a long decimal number and something wouldn't factor evenly. Let's try out one that is just that case. So -x squared plus 9x plus 18. This might look like something that would factor evenly, but it doesn't. So we're going to need the quadratic equation to help us out here. So what's a? Well, a is -1, b is 9, and c is 18. Let's get to solving. We'll sub into our equation -b, so -9, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 9 squared, minus 4 times a is -1 times c is 18, all over 2 times a, which is -1. Okay, so we subbed in Now let's simplify. Got to work inside this radical sign. 9 squared is 81. 4 times negative 1 times 18 is 72. Again, we're subtracting a negative, so pay attention to that. That means we're going to be adding those numbers together, because subtracting a negative, that's of course the same as adding. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Okay, so 81 plus 72, we're going to end up with 153. You might notice that there's no even square root for 153. So we're just going to need to use a decimal number for that if we want to do it exactly. So it's going to be plus or minus 12.4 when we round off to one decimal place. It's a repeating decimal though. Okay, so we got to try one direction is plus and one direction is our minus. Let's see what we get. So our first one is going to be x equals negative 9 plus 12.4 over negative 2. And our other one is going to be negative 9 minus 12.4 over negative 2. So we'll work those out. Our first one is going to work out to negative 1.7 when we round off to one decimal place. Our other one's going to work out to 10.7 when we round it off to one decimal place. So we wouldn't have been able to factor that one without the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula steps in and helps us. I just want to show you one last thing to finish off. We're not actually going to solve it, but I want to show you an equation where you might be up against something that looks a bit funkier. What about something like this? Well, this is a really ugly looking bit of algebra. And it turns out this is a quadratic, but we can't actually use the quadratic formula on this one because it's not in its proper form yet. So before we could use the quadratic formula, we would need to simplify and move everything over to one side. So I just want to simplify this. We're going to end up with 3x times 5x is 15x squared. 3x times negative 4 is going to be negative 12x. Then we've got our plus 2x, and that's going to equal x squared minus 4x plus 12. Whew. Now let's move everything over to one side. We're going to subtract x squared from this side. We'll add 4x from this side, and we'll subtract 12. And we'll do the same thing to this side. So we're going to end up with 14x squared minus 6x minus 12 equals 0. So we've simplified it now to this form here, and now we can use our quadratic equation. We can get our a, our b, and our c, and we can solve for x. But that started out much uglier, and we had to simplify before we could use our quadratic equation. And you might run into one like that as well. Okay, it's 3:26. It's the end of the day. I'm going to stop our video here.